What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be discussing CP point distributions as you're leveling up on a Magicka DPS. So this is going to be an update to the previous CP point distributions video because we do have additional CPs, and because there was a change to off balance, so the exploiter passive is now no longer as strong as it used to be, so we are going to be shifting our initial focus away from getting that exploiter passive right away and shifting it now to a different passives instead. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Now do note that different classes are going to have different CP setups. So the CP setup that I'm going to be showing you today, it's really focused on a very generalist approach. So it's going to be more balanced, but depending on the class that you're running, you might need to make a few small tweaks here and there. For example, you might need to take a couple of points out of Thaumaturge, for instance, and put them into Mastered Arms if your class tends to have more direct damage components versus damage over time components. In addition, this is also going to change as well depending on if you're running Mechanical Acuity or not. Generally speaking, if you're running Mechanical Acuity, you're going to put a little bit more emphasis on Elfborn than you would on any other of the remaining nodes. So that is something to keep in mind here. This is kind of a very generalist approach when it comes to where you should be putting your CP points as you're leveling as a Magicka DPS. So this particular distribution should be good for all of the different classes, but it won't be the best and most optimal distribution on each class, because a lot of that is going to depend on the amount of buffs that you're getting in your raid group, what specifically what sets you're running, and what class you are running. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So just like our previous CP point distribution video, we're going to be looking at distributions at various milestones or checkpoints. So the first one we're going to be touching on is going to be CP 160. Then we're going to be going to CP 300, CP 450, CP 600, and finally max CP, so CP 720. CP 160, that's obviously because we just hit the gear cap. CP 300, that's when you stop gaining additional resources, so health, magic, and stamina, from additional CPs. 450 is kind of where a lot of people say, okay, you kind of have enough CPs to go through the Vet Kraglorn trials, or you have enough blue CPs to increase your DPS up to the point where you are comfortably above the DPS checkpoint. CP 600 is kind of the middle of the road when it comes to recommended CP for clearing Vet Halls, Vet Maw, potentially even Vet Asylum +1 or Hard Mode. Again, that's just because you have more CPs now, you're able to do more damage because of the extra CPs that you can put into your blue trees. And then finally, of course, max CP, CP 720. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to start off here by hitting redistribute, clearing our CPs, and going into our green CP. So we're starting with CP 160. So this first little bit here is going to be a little bit longer than the rest, because I will be explaining why we're putting points into certain nodes, as well as some alternatives and other ways of thinking that you might want to consider while you're distributing your points. So you have 53 points to put into the green CP trees, and the 2 points that we're going to be focusing in on are going to be Arcanist and Tenacity. Arcanist is going to be pretty obvious why we're investing in that, and that's the Magicka regen. Tenacity, it might be a little bit less obvious why we're devoting so much emphasis on Tenacity. And that's because of the amount of Magicka that you get back from your heavy attacks. So Tenacity will help improve that, which in turn will help improve your sustain. So let's say normally you gain, let's say 3,000 Magicka on a heavy attack. If you have 15%, if you put 75 points into Tenacity when you're max CP, you get 14% additional. So you get on instead of 3,000, you're gaining closer to around 3,400 Magicka. Now that might not seem like a lot, but on longer fights, the more and more heavy attacks you do, the more it's going to help out your sustain, because that extra 400 does start to add up with each single heavy attack. So if you think about it, if you're doing 10 heavy attacks in a boss fight, you regained about an additional 4,000 Magicka over if you had no point into Tenacity. Another reason why we're focusing in on Tenacity is because it's more useful than Healthy and Mooncalf. Mooncalf gives you stamina regen, and that's not really going to be very important to you as a Magicka DPS. And then Healthy gives you health regen, and in trials, in 4-man content, you're typically going to be relying on your healer or healing abilities to get you back up to max health, and not your health regen. So we will be putting 27 points into Arcanist here. That hits the 7% jump point, and then we're going to be putting 26 into Tenacity, and that does miss the 7% jump point here. So jump points, what are they? So if you take a look here, this is a very good example of what demonstrating what a jump point is. So we can see here at 26 points in tenacity, we have 6.85% as our value. So the way ESO works, the way the code works, is that everything to the right of the decimal point is actually completely dropped off. So it doesn't actually round up, and it's not a precise 6.85%. It's actually, it completely ignores that 85%, that 0.85%, and so it'll only give you 6%. So in order to get up to 7%, we need to put in that additional point here, like we have in Arcanus to hit 27. And that brings us up to the next whole number. So jump points are these specific values where you jump from to the next whole number. So for example, 27 here would be a jump point for Arcanist and Tenacity. Now there are two different types of nodes in the blue, greens, and red CPs that are percentage based. So you have one type of node which maxes out at 15% when you have 100 points into it. So those are like Arcanist, Tenacity, Healthy, things like that. And then you have a second type of node which maxes out at 25% when you put all 100 points into it. And those are going to be things like Ironclad, Thick-Skinned, and Elfborn. So each of those two different type of nodes have different jump points, just because you know, they have more whole numbers for the 0 to 25 compared to 0 to 15. So that's something that you want to take into consideration as you're leveling. You want to make sure to hit those jump points when you're distributing your CP points as best as you can. Now, for example, in this case, you're not going to be able to distribute among these two nodes evenly enough to the point where you have, you know, you're hitting both jump points, and that's going to be perfectly fine. As you're leveling, just make sure to add points until you hit that next jump point here. So for, you know, let's say you managed to get additional 5 CPs or something, you know, you would put 1 here and you would put maybe like 4 in here or something until you get up to the next jump point, and so on. So that's kind of what you would do as you're leveling. You just kind of focus in on one, get to the next whole number, focus in on tenacity next, get to the next whole number, and so on and so forth. So this is our green CPs. Now for our blue CPs, so this is obviously going to be varying depending on the class specifically, but like I said at the beginning of the video, we're going to go with a more generalist approach. So this is going to be good for any sort of class. Now the passive that we're going to want to get is now no longer going to be Exploiter. So Exploiter was very powerful in the last patch because off balance had no cooldown. So we want to get off balance as quickly, this Exploiter passive as quickly as we can to get that 10% additional damage done. Now that off balance does have a cooldown, and now it's only up for about 25% on average. Your next node that you're going to want to hit is going to be spell precision, because that increases your spell crit by 12%. And then from there, there's really no other real passives that are useful here. The other one that you might find useful would be Riposte. If you have to block something, it does have a chance to deal damage, but that's not that's pretty minor. And that's pretty much it. So you can try to go for Exploiter if you'd like, but it's not going to be nearly as strong. With the 25% uptime on off balance, this 10% is really going to be an effective around 2.5%. So that's, you know, that greatly diminished the value of getting Exploiter. So we're going to focus in on trying to get spell precision first. So Elemental Expert is going to be the first node that we're going to invest in. So we're going to put 23 points into Elemental Expert. Going to hit 11 into Elfborn. By the way, we do have 53 points here to distribute, so right now we're sitting at 34, which means we have 19 more points to put in. So we're going to put 9 into Master at Arms, and then 10 into Thaumaturge. So we're not quite hitting the jump point here with Thaumaturge. We are off by 1, but like I said with the green CPs, you're just going to need to add points in until you manage to hit the next jump point here. And again, this is going to vary depending on your specific class, but this is going to be a very generalist approach. So obviously Elemental Expert is going to give us the best return when it comes to our CPs, just because it increases all the damage done, Flame, Frost, Shock, Magic. So this is every single type of magic ability. Plus, this also boosts not just the damage that you deal with abilities, but also if you're using any proc sets that deal this type of damage. So if you're using, for example, Grothar as a monster helm, Elemental Expert will boost the damage that Grothar deals. It'll also boost the damage that your enchants deal as well. So if you have a flame damage enchant, Elemental Expert does boost the damage on your flame enchant. So that's why Elemental Expert is probably the best one to invest early in. Elfborn is critical strikes, critical damage. It'll improve the amount that you deal when you critically hit. Master at Arms increases damage done with direct damage attacks. So direct damage attacks are basically any attack that deals all of its damage in one blow. So for example, Force Pulse, That is considered a direct damage attack. It's actually 3 direct damage attacks because there's 3 separate hits that deal all the damage in one hit. So those are direct damage attacks. Then you have damage over time, which is thaumaturge, and damage over time is basically any dot in the game. So something like Fetter Infection on a Magicka Warden, blockade of elements is the classic damage over time that all Magicka DPS use. So that's where thaumaturge, that's the type of abilities that thaumaturge work with. Now there are a couple of quirky abilities here and there that don't necessarily scale very nicely with the with these passives because, for example, Fetter Infection back in the previous patch actually scaled off of Master at Arms and not thaumaturge, but a lot of them have been fixed. But there are still potentially a few that might not be accurately increased by their appropriate CP points. That's something to take into consideration. Now finally for our red CPs, so our red CPs, if you guys have watched any of my build videos, you know that when I talk about the red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach, but ultimately your distribution is going to potentially vary depending on the content you're running. So there's 4 major nodes that we're going to be investing in. So we're going to be investing in Ironclad, which decreases damage from direct damage, Thick Skin, which decreases damage from damage over time, Hardy, which decreases damage from pretty much all the physical sources, so that's physical, poison, disease damage, and Elemental Defender, which reduces all your magical damage, so Frost, Flame, Shock, and Magic damage. So you can think of damage being split into 4 different categories: physical, direct, damage over time, and then magical, direct, and damage over time. And each of the different endgame contents, whether that be something like Dragonstar Arena, Vet DLC dungeons, the trials in the game, they all have different distributions of these 4 different types of damage. So for example, Helra Citadel, which is a Vet trial, it's a trial in Craglorn. If you're a DPS, you're typically going to be taking more physical damage compared to magical damage. In fact, I believe there's only one mob in that trial that actually deals magical damage. So, you know, if you're going to be running Hell Ra for that night, it might behoove you to take points out of Elemental Defender and put them into Hardy and Ironclad. Thick Skinned generally is not going to be quite as useful, and this is kind of how I think of it. So let's say you have 2 abilities, 1 direct damage, 1 damage over time, and they both deal 20k when they hit you. Ironclad will protect you from the 20k direct damage hit. It'll reduce that amount. Thick-Skinned, on the other hand, let's say it's a 20k damage total that's directed over 5 seconds, and it ticks every 1 second. That means each second you're actually only taking 4,000 damage rather than the 20,000 all up front with the direct damage hit. Now, because you're taking less damage over that 1 second period, you're able to heal through it with, through Healing Springs, Mutagen, Breath of Life, or something like that. So it's not quite as important to invest so many points in the Thick Skin as it is in Ironclad, because a lot of dots in this game you can actually just heal or shield right through it, because the ticks are generally smaller compared to the direct damage. So again, think of 20k all in one go, or 20k spread out over 5 seconds. Now, this isn't going to be representative of all dots. There are some dots in the game that have very strong ticks. So you still want to have a fair amount of points into Thick Skin in order to decrease the damage there. But generally speaking, you will know ahead of time. Hopefully your raid lead will tell you ahead of time, we're going to go into this trial, make sure to put some points into Thick Skin because of this dot. We're going to take a one-size-fits-most approach, so we're going to go for a more balanced approach, but again, depending on the trial that you're running, you might want to, shift your CP points accordingly, depending on the type of damage that you're going to anticipate taking in those trials. And there's also one more thing I want to mention here, and this is a weird quirk in the coding. So right now, if you put points into Hardy and Elemental Defender first, and then you put them in a Thick Skinned and Ironclad next, you will get the full damage mitigation. If you do it in reverse, however, you actually end up losing a little bit of damage mitigation. So when you are redistributing, if you're distributing your points, try to put them into Hardy and Elemental Defender first, and then confirm, and then put the remaining points into Thick Skinned and Ironclad and confirm a second time. That way you get the full amount of damage mitigation that you should get. We're not quite sure what's causing this. It seems to be some weirdness in ZOS's code, and we haven't heard any word about it getting fixed, so that's just what we're going to have to deal with for the time being. So at CP 160 we have 54 points to put into our red CPs. So we're going to hit the 4% on both of these nodes. 4% jump point here, which is 15 on each, and then we're going to that leaves us 30, which means we have 24 left. We're going to hit 6 here, so that's 13, and then we're going to put 11 into thick skin to hit the 5% jump point here. So that gives us, this is our 54 distribution here. So we're going for a more balanced approach here, but as we get more and more CPs, we're actually going to start leaving thick skin behind and investing more into ironclad. Now we're going to move on to the next milestone, which is CP 300. Now at this point, I've pretty much explained all there is, so the rest of these jump points, the rest of these milestones are going to go by pretty quickly here. So for CP 300, you have 100 points to put into each of the 3 different constellations. And we're still focusing in here on these 2 nodes, so we're actually going to be doing splitting it evenly, 50 and 50. So we're not quite hitting the 12% jump point, we're actually 1 point above the 11% jump point. But again, like I mentioned, this is just because we're not getting enough CP points to hit the next jump points and evenly split them. Now for our blue CPs here, we're going to put, again, more points into Elemental Expert here, so we're going to hit the 9% jump point, which is 37. Bump this up to 7. Bump this up to 20. Bump this up to 20 as well. That still leaves us with 7 points, and then you can put the remainder 70 points into here, so you hit the 10% jump point into Elfborn. So 23 Elfborn, 37 Elemental Expert, 20 into Master at Arms, and 20 into Thaumaturge. Now you might be asking why we're not putting any points into Spell Erosion right now, and that's because I will be talking about this in my Magicka leveling guide, Magicka DPS leveling guide that I'm going to release later on. But you will generally be running the Lover while you are still working on getting up to max CP, and that's just because you need that extra penetration, and the CP points are going to be better invested in these nodes compared to Spell Erosion, at least for right now. Once you get up to a certain point, then you're going to need more points to get to the next jump point for each of the nodes, because ZOS has shifted the points, so now you get a lot more points in the first 50 compared to the second 50. So once you kind of get up to the 50s in the nodes, then that's when you are going to see bigger returns when you put them into Spell Erosion instead. And then for our red CPs, we're going to be hitting 7% on both of these. We're going to hit 7% here as well. Oops. And we're going to hit 30 here. So we're just shy of the 13% jump point here by 1. And again, you will hit that as you level, as you gain more CP points. Now for the next milestone, which is CP 450. So now we have 150 points, and this is again pretty simple for the green CPs. You're going to hit 75 and 75 here. Now at this point you are done with these 2 nodes. You can continue to put points here up to 100. However, the jump point, because these nodes top out at 15, you can see that you will take 25 points to get to 100, which means 25 points to get to the full 15% return. Some people think that's worth it, other people don't. I'm one of the people in the camp that thinks that it's not worth putting 25 points here, and it's worth putting points elsewhere, so you're able to make better use of the remaining 90 points that you have up until you get to max CP. So at this point here, you can kind of put your points wherever you feel like. My personal recommendation is to start putting them into Shadow Ward, Tumbling, and Warlord. And that's going to depend on the passives you want. So for example, Snare here is for Bash. It's not that great, but Inspiration Boost on the other hand is a very useful passive to grab if you are still trying to level up your crafting skills. And over here on the Shadow side, you have Fortune Seeker, which increases the gold you find when you loot treasure chests, Merchant Favored, which reduces the cost of repairing your armor, and Treasure Hunter, which increases the quality of the items you find in treasure chests. So these 3 passives are, in my opinion at least, much stronger than the passives over here. Inspiration Boost is the only really useful one here. And so I tend to start putting points here into Shadow Ward and Tumbling first to get at least Merchant Favorite, at least up to here. But that's kind of up to you how you want to play around with it. So I would put into Shadow Ward and Tumbling and Warlord. All 3 of these nodes max out at 25, so they do have different jump points compared to Tenacity and Arcana, so that's just something you want to keep in mind there. Now for our blue CPs, we're going to be hitting 56 with Elemental Expert, so that's going to be 12% right here. Then we're going to be hitting 15% in Elfborn, jumping up to 13 here, and 26 here. So we are hitting the 11% jump point here with Thaumaturge, as you can see. And then we have 13 at the Master at Arms, 56 into Elemental Expert, 37 into Elfborn. We are still going to continue to invest in these 4 nodes. At this point here, you can kind of avoid putting more points at Elemental Expert. The next jump point is 64, and that's probably the last one that I would recommend you hit. So get yourself up to 64 in Elemental Expert, and then start putting into Elfborn and Master at Arms next. Those are the next 2 most useful nodes for Magicka DPS in general. Finally, for our red CPs, we're going to be hitting the 11% jump point now here, so that's a pretty big jump here. Then we're going to be hitting 34 here. I'm going to be putting 2 points here to hit that 8% jump point here in Thick Skinned. So you can see here we're starting to weigh a little bit more heavily into Ironclad compared to Thick Skinned now. And we're still going to be putting points into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Just like with Elemental Expert, you would want to hit either 56 or 64 depending on your own personal preferences. Finally, our final, or not our final, but penultimate, I should say, CP milestone, which is 600 CP. Now you have 200 to split across each of the nodes, so now you have an additional 50 points. So you can do something like this. You don't have to follow what I do. Oops, put a little bit too much here. My mistake. You could do 22 into Tumbling, 20 into Shadow Ward, or you can bring this down to like 23 and do 23, and then you can put the remaining 4 into here, so you get a little bit of points here. You can split them up however you like, but those are the 3 nodes that you would start to play around with. For our blue CPs here, we're actually going to go up to 64 here in Elemental Expert. We're going to be hitting 19 here with Elfborn, and we're going to be hitting 19 here in Master at Arms. Going to be going up to 31 here in Thaumaturge, and then we're going to start putting our points into Spell Erosion. Now at this point you can start putting points into Spell Erosion, and one thing that you're going to want to be mindful of as you consider whether you want to put things into Spell Erosion, the other node that you might want to consider putting points into is to continue to put them into Master at Arms or Thaumaturge. It's kind of up to you. But you can start putting points into Spell Erosion if you'd like, so you can actually shift these into Thaumaturge if you'd like, and you would actually hit the 14% jump point. But that's going to really be dependent on your group and the type of content you're running. So for 4-mans, you might want to invest into Spell Erosion now if you don't intend on doing Vet Trials. If you do intend on doing Vet Trials, take a look at what your raid groups are running. If they're using Alkosh or Infused Torag's Crusher, add up those penetration debuff values and see how many additional penetration points you would need to hit the penetration cap. So that's going to be variable depending on your specific group. At this point here, we're done with Elemental Expert. So then we can probably put a couple more points into Elfborn. You can probably hit up to 56 is the next jump point, and the next jump point after that, the 21%, I believe, is 61. So those are 2 jump points you can try to hit. Same thing with Master at Arms, 56 and 21. And Thaumaturge. Thaumaturge isn't quite as powerful as it used to be back in Clockwork City, so I would actually only top out Thaumaturge at around 40 or 44. Now for our red CPs, we're going to be bumping ourselves up to 64 here. Leaves us 20 points. So we're going to pump a couple of points into Ironclad. We're actually going to hit the 19% jump point. Then we're going to hit the 9% jump point here. We actually skipped the 9% actually. Yeah, we do skip the 9% jump point here. Again, we're starting with the focus on Ironclad more. At this point now, we're pretty much done with Hardened Elemental Defender because the next jump point is going to be 75. And then you can probably start putting a lot more points, focus into Thick Skinned and Ironclad here. Now finally, we're at max CP, so depending on your class, you can go to the specific build video. It's kind of up to you, but this, again, I'm going to show you a very generalist approach while you're trying to figure out your rotations and builds. So this is max CP, 28 into Warlord, 31 Tumbling, 31 Shadow Ward. You do hit all the jump points that way. You can move one of these down to like 28 and move this up to 31 if you want the Inspiration Boost passive. Blue CPs. We're done with Elemental Expert. We're going to push Elfborn up to 56. We're going to push Master at Arms also up to 56. We're going to be pushing Thaumaturge up to 40. That leaves us with 21 points. So now this is where things can get a little bit interesting depending on your specific build. You can start putting points into Spell Erosion, like so. You can put a couple points into Staff Expert even. You know, it's just to make use of the passives. Staff Expert is one of the very strange ones because it actually scales much higher than the other CPs. So here, let me take some points out of these so you can see what it actually scales all the way up to. So it actually scales all the way up to 35. So that's one of the weird ones. So let me put all of my points back. We can do something like this if you'd like, but again, it all depends on how many points you're ultimately going to put into Spell Erosion. Even if you have Torg's Infused Crusher and Alkosh, you will still need to have like 11 to 10 points in Spell Erosion, so let's assume you are running in the best optimized group available. You know, you can do something like this and just put 13 points into Staff Expert here. You do hit the 8% jump point here with 13 there. And for our red CPs, we're done with Hardy Elemental Expert. We're at 64. I'm going to put 34 here. I'm going to hit the 21% jump point here. Actually put this up to 40, and we're going to put the remaining 11 actually into Bastion. So for Magicka DPS, two nodes that passives you might want to consider taking are going to be Field Physician and Infusion. At the very least, you want Field Physician because that reduces the damage you take while you're resurrecting somebody, and as a Magicka DPS, you have access to shields, so you're probably going to be the first ones that are going to be asked to res people. And so you kind of want to have that Field Physician passive, because this does decrease the amount of damage that your shield takes as well. Infusion is another useful passive. As you can see here, when you resurrect somebody, you increase your Magicka regen by a good amount for 8 seconds, but that is a little bit more of an investment. You need 30 points, 31 if you want to hit the jump point in Bastion. So some people don't like putting that many points into Bastion, because it does take away from Thick-Skinned and Ironclad and things like that. And some people don't even like putting 11 points into Bastion at all. You know, they don't actually want the Field Physician passive at all. So if you're going that route, then you can just do 51 to Thick-Skinned and hit that 90% jump point there. Alright, so that is it for this video. So those are the various CP point distributions. Like I said, with the blue CPs, that's a very generalist approach. It'll work well for every class, but it's not necessarily going to be the optimal distribution for every class. You're going to want to check out each build video to look at the build that you're using. Use the Constellations add-on if you're on PC. It's recently been updated along with Combat Metrics. We use them both together to get the best the optimal CP point distributions. So just keep that in mind. Same thing with the red CPs. There are going to be times where you might want to redistribute them to best optimize for the trial that you're going to be running that night. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.